Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. The fact that she was a common pride in her hometown. Not only was she beautiful, but she graduated from school with a gold medal and entered the Institute of International Relations without money or sponsorship. For villagers living in a remote corner of a remote province, such a news was like a miracle. Did you hear that our girl has entered the institute? How? God gave the girl a gift and kissed her on the forehead. All the members of her family are simple people. Mother, father, grandmother, and grandfather worked on the farm for a whole century. And look at her. Where does she come from? What's in a man? The conversations go on, and at last a month has passed since the precious letter from the Institute arrived in town in early September. The envelope arrived very late. The mail always reached them at the last shift. While it was being sorted in the district, while it was being delivered to all the villages in the neighborhood. And the center itself was always late. At that time, there were no telephones in the small village, no pharmacy. And in general, there was almost nothing except a small grocery store where you could get matches, soap, some canned goods, and other consumer products. For any need you had to travel, and sometimes even walk 12 kilometers one way. The children went to school in an old bus, 3 boys and a girl, nothing more. Village school children. An elderly English teacher in a secondary school achieved in the person of this small, quiet as a mouse little girl the longed-for dream of any teacher, a real pupil, a pupil who really wants to master the subject and also has the necessary talent, persistence, and stamina. During 20 years of working in a rural school, David has never found the slightest desire to learn a language in children. And this girl was special, completely different from the others, whom I had to force to learn at least the minimum required to pass to the next grade. In the 4th grade, in the first year of language learning, she sat through the whole lesson as if hypnotized without saying a word, and listening to the teacher's explanations literally with her mouth open. As soon as the bell rang, the class of 12 impatient children flew out the door as if blown away by the wind. One of them remained seated at his desk as if he hadn't even heard the bell. They all said quietly, "David, class is over. You can go." But the girl didn't even move from her seat. She raised her big, surprised eyes and asked timidly, "Is it true? What is true?" The teacher did not understand. "Is it true that then there are people who speak differently from us?" She clarified, puzzled. "Of course it's true," nodded David. "In the world there are many countries and other languages. I thought it was only in a fairy tale." Emily sighed with admiration. And the teacher realized that for that girl, foreign speech sounded like a magic spell, like a key that opens the door to another world. And so it was, in fact. The language barrier is the biggest obstacle for a person who refuses to want to live in a foreign country. But the professor suddenly found inspiration and said that sitting next to the girl language will open before you the whole world, then the wall. Emily looked at him incredulously. "I will help you," the teacher promised, "but you must try your best. Did you understand?" "Yes." "Really?" The girl nodded. "That's right." Since then, they have been working very hard, both the teacher and the student. David, inspired by his pupil's efforts, on his days off went to a large regional center, looked for the necessary manuals, borrowed books from the library, and did his best to impart as much knowledge as possible. The skilled student fully met her teacher's expectations. She finally saw that her work was undirected, that her potential had been wasted for years. In this godforsaken place, she was realizing it. In 7th grade, David had a serious conversation with her parents. "I think their daughter needs tutoring." "With whom?" The mother didn't understand. "With a teacher." "Where can we get one?" The woman shrugged her shoulders. "I know one. He's retired now. Unwilling to take Emily with him on weekends." The mother was confused. She meant, "Man, are you crazy, Bills? How much money is that?" But the authority of the teacher and the school in general in those days was high, and she did not dare to speak in that tone, and just said, blushing and averting her eyes, that the family has no money for such trips. And our father, added Ella, sighing, unlikely to allow Emily. Father is a man and in general cool temper, and after half a liter is better and not to speak at all. Already more than once expressed, to put it mildly, with disapproval about the constant delays. Point after lessons. What's that? He said, frowning and waggling his eyebrows. It's a fad. Why the hell does he have to know the language so well? Or is it that the cows here don't understand it? Come on, Nick was trying to soften you up. Emily's mad at her mother. Do you feel sorry for her? I mean, they don't charge us for this. That's it. Dad's pointing the finger at us. They're not charging us yet. My gut tells me it's gonna come to that. I'm not giving them any money. You hear me? Not a dime's worth of work. This is no time to be fooling around. You'd better teach the girl to work around the house. They'll invent English too. Woo! He cursed and slammed the door. I'll talk to him calmly, David said. And don't worry about money. The district executive committee will pay a grant to a talented student. Emily didn't win the regional contest 3 times for nothing. Well, if that's the way her mother waved her hands, that was the end of the conversation. True, the father has learned something with David. Once a week he'll ride another angry teacher like a raging bull. But the mother stoically endured all his violent attacks and sent her daughter to her grandmother. Out of harm's way. The family storm subsided and ended in an alcoholic truce, somewhere in the homes of fellow villagers, where Nick always went with his friends for drinks. His mother, who had long since become accustomed to this arrangement, did not mind, and she just wouldn't leave her drunken husband at the door until he sobered up. After a drunken binge, he always came back quieter than grass, and for a few weeks the house was quiet and peaceful. The first class with Frank was with a grizzled old professor who, as David said, had worked for many years as a simultaneous interpreter even in the capital, at a foreign embassy. But now, in his old age, he had returned to his homeland, leaving an apartment in the capital to his son. It was like a dream. You, my daughter, must change your pronunciation, this new teacher told her. David has taught you the grammar quite well, and your vocabulary is also good. But your pronunciation is not good. You'll have to excuse me, my friend. Frank turned embarrassedly to the teacher, who was sitting a little farther away. Don't be, Frank, he replied calmly. It's not necessary. I understand it all perfectly well myself. That's why I brought Shinko to you. And you did absolutely the right thing. Together with you, we will perfectly prepare this young lady for her admission. Yes, yes. Smiling, he looked at Emily's flushed neck. That's how young, lovely, and capable a lady will soon have you, my dear, to shine. Now off you go. You have a train to catch, David, said Emily cautiously on the way back, when they were already seated in the carriage, looking at the monotonous passing scenery. Do you really think I can come in? Yes, of course, replied the professor. There are possibilities and very good ones. Now that your pronunciation will be taken care of by a person of such a level, you are simply doomed to success. She answered nothing, but sat silently looking out of the window. It seemed to her that such a prospect was very unrealistic. At home, the girl had no one to support her. There was nothing to say about the father, and the mother, who in the depths of her soul, of course, very much wished that her only daughter had a different fate than herself. She did not give him much cause for hope, for her own life experience told her that the hopes of her youth were not destined to be realized. However, her sensitive maternal heart, though hardened, indeed, and unformed by life, was enough not to set a trap for her daughter. So she simply kept silent and maintained a neutral position. When Emily returned to town in the afternoon, on her first day of visiting the teacher, she found unexpected support in the person of her elderly grandmother. Let's go to sleep at my house, honey, her grandmother Wendy called her. I've made cranberry pies. Emily loved having a sleepover at Grandma's house, in her quiet little home. There was no constant irritability from her father. No one fought, no one yelled, no one mumbled the same non-stop in front of the TV in the evenings. All in all, She would have loved to live at her grandmother's house, but he can't leave his miserable mother behind. Why would he do such a thing? And her father was against her staying at her grandmother's. "Aren't you at home?" Angrily, she asked her daughter. "It's warm, it's light, and I have my own room. What more do you need?" "I'm fine, Dad, I'm fine. It's just that Grandma needs help." "Also guilty," Emily replied. "Well, help during the day. And at night, to keep the house uncluttered," the father summarized. So often on Grandma Wendy to visit did not work. But tonight was a rare occasion when his father was in a good mood, so he hardly objected. Once he had asked to spend the night at home. Only once had her father changed the thick ropes they carried, and the board was still the same as when she was a child. Emily would sit there for an hour in the heat of the day, rocking quietly and learning English verbs, complex and obscure. In the beginning, tenses are indefinite, simple continuation, perfect continuation. "That's autumn, dear," her grandmother told her late in the afternoon, when they sat wearily together at the long table and drank herbal tea. Emily looked at her grandmother in disbelief. "Why are you doing this, Grandma?" "Don't quit," Grandma continued with conviction. "You will go out into the real world. You'll get out of here into the big world. The village is dying. The smartest young people are going to the city. Who's left here? Only those who can't go there. And you're a girl with a head. I don't know who really. So study, study. I'll give you money for the road. When it's time to go to Washington on the map, I've got some things. I save my pension. What does an old lady need?" She caressed her granddaughter's cheek affectionately. My dear Emily wept from such touching grandmotherly tenderness, and hope settled in her soul. So she really does have a chance. As David used to say, if Grandma is willing even to take extreme measures, then she will certainly go on to conquer the dreaded and unapproachable college. And so, 3 years after that memorable conversation, it was time to go, to pass the exams. "Don't be afraid of anything," David told her, who called her to accompany his best student on this long journey. "You know everything very well. Do what we teach you and answer the teacher as if you were in class with Frank. Remember that you have an advantage over the others. Your perfect record. You're going to be fine. Let's go. Good luck." Emily remembered only the exam papers printed on the nice letterheads of the institute, and her oral answers in front of a whole committee of earnest professors had been completely erased from her memory, and her faces had faded, except for the one of a man sitting in the center, with a black mustache and attentive brown eyes, who nodded approvingly after the answers and asked without smiling and without expressing his attitude, "Where did she study? What program?" Emily answered that she had been helped by a teacher from her hometown. The examiner slightly raised an eyebrow and asked what was her professor's name. "Aya. I don't know," Emily answered sadly, and felt so small and insignificant that she almost cried in the classroom. "It's okay, you can go." The teacher turned around casually, preparing to listen to the next applicant, David, who was pacing nervously back and forth across the university square, saw Emily and rushed over to her. "Emily, how did it go? They asked me what Frank's last name was." Emily said in a trembling voice, and so it was. And finally she burst into tears on her kind teacher's shoulder. Yes, voluntarily from pent-up emotions. "What are you? What are you?" soothed David. "It doesn't matter at all. The results of the exam were published the next day, and you got a good grade. The passing grade will be calculated after the second promotion exams were announced to everyone at the final meeting at the training center. Admission lists will be posted at the end of August and mailed to out-of-towners." In the evening, Emily and David went home to wait, when the long-awaited envelope arrived from the district center. At home were only father and mother, who had gone to get mushrooms across the river in the distant woods. "Look, here's a letter from Washington." Nick cheerfully handed the envelope to his daughter as soon as he closed the door behind them. Probably writing a cancellation. He laughed at her crude joke, and Emily burst out, grabbed the envelope and ran out of the house. Not hearing her father's angry shouts, she was lucky. A bus was coming to the stop, and she didn't have to walk the 4 miles to the track, where she could wait for one to pass. The school building was silent. September 1 this year was Friday, and no one was to be seen here today, except for the cleaning lady, even some teachers. "Haven't you seen? David came in today?" I asked the janitor. "I don't think so." She said no. But looking at the newspaper, the girl ran to the second floor and yanked open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Emily gritted her teeth in frustration and just as quickly ran out of the school. As she ran toward David's house, which was on a hill on the edge of town, her heart was about to burst out of her chest. It was all he could say as he dropped the crumpled envelope on the table. It arrived in the morning. The teacher looked carefully at the envelope and cut the edge with large scissors so as not to accidentally touch the leaf inside. She sent it to him. Next came Emily's last name and initials, the list of applicants who had successfully passed the entrance exams and were enrolled in the first year of the Institute of International Relations. I ran my eyes over David's and scrolled down the list below. The last names were not in alphabetical order, but according to their scores. "Look." Solemnly, he handed the sheet to Emily at the bottom of the list, and with a shrinking heart, the girl read her last name near the bottom of the long list. "I got in?" she asked, incredulously, raising her eyes to the professor. The lines swam in front of her eyes, and she felt dizzy. "Yes," David shouted, grabbed Emily by the shoulders and started dancing. "You did it, you did it. I told you you'd get in." Emily laughed and cried. She couldn't say a word, but then she stopped like a stump. "David, he says classes start on the 4th. I'm not going to make it." "You will," said the teacher firmly. "You run and get ready, and I'll go to the station and get the tickets. Nothing extra, just the essentials. And here's something else." She put a double-folded envelope in his hand. "This is an envelope for you for the first time." "What is it?" The girl looked at the envelope in bewilderment and immediately realized and burst into flames. "No, David, take it. It will come in handy." The professor looked at her tenderly. "You are like a daughter to me." The next day, her relatives and friends bade her farewell in Washington. Her grandmother, who had not been to the station, also gave her an envelope before the trip, and Emily now felt fabulous, richer. She just had to find out what life in the capital was really like. On the first day, she was informed that there were still no places in the dorm, and that she had to sign up for the waiting list. She was speechless. He arrived at the classroom with his suitcase and sat down at the table, not knowing where he would go after class. But fate was kind to her. After class, she was stopped by the mustachioed professor who had asked her about Frank's last name. At the beginning of class, he introduced himself as a student, but Emily, immersed in her unhappy thoughts about the name and patronymic, couldn't remember. "Emily," more affirmative than interrogative, she said. "Come with me." They walked down the long corridors to the course study area, where the women seated at their typewriters and desks rose to their feet at the sight of their advisor as a soldier in drill. "Jacob, good afternoon." "Hi." He greeted them all at once. "And what are you beauties?" My medalist girl wasn't allowed. "Why is she sitting in my classroom with a suitcase?" The women fell cautiously silent, looking at their interlocutor. Finally, one of them, apparently the boldest, ventured cautiously. "So Cindy told me what Cindy told me to do." A man rushed in. "Didn't I bluntly warn you that priority would be given to medalists from the provinces? How many slots do we have?" 11 medalists from the field in this intake. 2. The same brave one who answered timidly. 2, shouted the teacher. 2 for the whole country. And we can't give them a place in the hostel. Shame on us. If I hear anything like that in the next group, they can write a letter of dismissal. "Sure, yes." Jacob almost cried. He told an employee. And he left, but he didn't slam the door. As if Emily's father had covered it up quietly. "It's a nightmare," said one of the women. "What a racket." Emily smiled inwardly. What did they know about how scattered these Muscovites were settled in the hostel? It turned out to be noisy, crowded, and cheerful. Here and there, different colorful personalities peeked out, some in what, some in almost nothing. And shamefully unaccustomed to such a thing as tortured to avert his eyes, to look at the unknown guys in just sweatpants was for her the height of shamelessness. Hurry up. Making her way through the motley crowd, she found her room and knocked on the door. Timidly Ken opened the door. "Come in." A blonde girl with dark gray eyes, sitting on a green bed, answered cheerfully. "You're my neighbor." "Yes," Emily confirmed. There went the girl's false sadness. I expected her to give up my bunk. And seeing the fear and bewilderment in her eyes, the new girl laughed. "Just kidding. Come on in, please. Let me show you around." The neighbor's name was Helen. She lived in a nearby city and was therefore also considered a foreigner. Although she knew Washington like the back of her hand and also the high school, her older brother had studied here, and she herself had taken preparatory courses for 2 years before entering. Putting her few things back in place, Emily sat down on the bed, looked around the room, and at last felt that she was really here not on Bird's license, but with full rights. From now on, he is a student and will live and study here, just like everyone else. In 3rd grade, she is already one of the best students, an activist, editor of the student newspaper, and in general, a favorite of the faculty. I met Dan, a handsome graduate whose parents were known to be diplomats. He lives alone with his strict grandmother and will be interning next fall. How did you meet him? More like met. They already knew each other, but only casually. Emily. In high school, all the dogs knew Dan too, but they had never been able to do anything together to socialize properly. The difference between freshman and junior year was abysmal, but between junior and senior year, not so much. That year was also the first year he was elected to the student council, and Dan was its executive secretary for the 3rd year in a row. At first, the old council members just looked at the newcomers who had just been elected, assessing who was worth what. The 1980s were coming to an end. There was the smell of change in the air, and the students, like all modern youth, they were gradually, and sometimes openly, beginning to disregard fundamental values, to break the foundations and behave more freely. Once, having come to the council meeting half an hour in advance, and not on purpose, but just the time left free between peers, she discovered that in the office of the Komsomol organization of the Institute, where, in fact, most of the meetings of the student organizations took place, the members of the council and others who had joined them were reading poetry. She sat in the background and listened to the poems. She was amazed, not to say stupefied. They were reading from authors she knew nothing about, and from acquaintances, things like that, which neither in school nor in high school had she ever come close to. The speakers and listeners got carried away and did not realize that they had already taken up half of the time allotted for the student council meeting. Emily then, unlike many others, saw perfectly, but did not rush to interrupt the speakers. Finally, someone noticed, and those who were not on the board picked up their books and left. Dan gave the remaining ones a stern look. "I hope there are no snitches among us," muttered almost all of them, indicating their position. "No, of course not. What are you saying? How can you think that?" and other things like that. Emily remained silent and did not utter a single word until the assembly began. Then, as the students began to disperse, Dan approached her. "Emily, why were you silent when I asked the snitch?" Emily smiled slightly, leaving her serious eyes. "I consider it unnecessary to make known obvious facts, and in general." He looked at her with interest. "We'll talk about the obvious facts when we have free time." "When do you have free time?" She answered boldly. "Personally, I don't have any free time yet." "You don't eat or drink?" She smiled. "Why don't I eat? Of course I do, like everyone else in the canteen. But I think your suggestion suggests a more private place to eat and other things related to that process. What do you look like?" He looked at her appreciatively and raised his eyebrows slightly. "You eat in the bedroom?" "Yes," she nodded simply. "But I don't recommend it. We have a ferocious Cerberus in the hall. It's Jenna, It's Cerberus, laughed Dan. But she's got one left. I'd like to see it. Molly smiled, imagining a scene involving Dan, the scientist, and a screaming janitor and Jenna. However, Jenna didn't care about that at all. Where are you going? You can't see in here, and only residents are allowed. The residents themselves, who wanted to receive guests, drained Jenna in various ways. The most reliable, oddly enough, was not money, but a ball of wool of which she was a passionate knitter. Jenna took the meager stewardship by any means necessary. Let's see. The janitor unceremoniously shook the balls of wool on the table, and after evaluating them with a critical eye, muttered something like 15 times 8 times 4 pairs. Is that enough? The same for a whole sweater. Depending on the value of the offering, certain conditions were left to the guests, which Jenna Mikhailovna fixed alone and followed very attentively. She locked the front door, so that in her absence no one dared to enter or leave. She ran through the floors, shouting to the entire 8th corridor. 15 minutes left. 15 minutes left. And then, with a sense of accomplishment, she would come back and take the door from those waiting for their bosses. Jenna was very appreciative, and for her selfless work she was always thanked. And sometimes something tangible, I might add. So Dan, if she wanted to win the hearts, Emily had to accomplish the first feat of outwitting the vigilant servant of Athos, Emily. Although she enjoyed the attention of the popular high school student, she didn't give it much thought. She had been strictly educated and never thought of flirting. Hey, do you mind if Betty and Maria come over tonight? With the boys, Emily smiled. And Tony's coming, I guess. Yes, it's a matter of caring, Helen replied. You're not sorry, I'm not sorry. But sir, I am. Emily asked and doubted the possibility of the neighbor's plan. Oh, we've already agreed with her. Helen waved her hand. The boys got her 6 balls of mohair on Saturday. Now until the end of the month the passage is open. Then I'm off to the kitchen, nodding. Emily, have fun. Have you ever thought of getting a boyfriend? Asked Helen, almost pityingly. You'll die a spinster, don't worry about me. Emily dismissed her. I'll die. Not you. I mean, I'd long been used to noisy, neighborly parties, but I never participated in them myself. Why did I earn a blue silk reputation on the course? I do not disturb the lives of others. Please, here is a room for you. Have a good time. At such hours, after taking his textbooks, he would go to the empty kitchens or to the library, if it was still open. But today he was often prevented from studying in peace. An agitated Helen also ran in and shouted from Emily's door, "Come quickly. There's a lot going on in there. Now what?" The girl looked at her friend unhappily. "Maybe you can spare me." "No way." Poe shook her head. "Helen, we can't go without you." Sighing and putting aside his notebook, he obediently got up and followed her. The room buzzed with activity and excitement. The window curtains had been opened, and Emily had one foot outside the window, despite the cold, and outside, Emily was breaking into an icy sweat. She had barely seen the painting. Outside, on the iron of the street sill, she was clutching Dan's window sashes and clenching a long purple rose between her teeth. "There's no way she's going to agree to jump into the room until you get there," squealed the girls, and the boys grinned, making approving gestures. "Dan, please come down here," asked Emily. The boy defiantly let go of her hand and pretended to fall. Emily gasped and rushed forward. Then he quickly jumped down the slope into the room and knelt down, holding out a rose to her. "Oh, incomparable and unapproachable lady," he began pathetically. "Let the hero decorate your home with this beautiful flower." Toe was angered by such a silly joke and laughed in relief at the same time. No one was hurt. It was over. Besides, his addressing her with that phrase about the unapproachable lady reminded him of his lessons long ago with Frank. Then he also called her Miss. No one else had said it. And now here we are. "Bravo, sir." Boys shouting, whistling, and banging their fists on the bedside table. What a number. As Cerberus runs, one of the lookout students bursts into the room. "What's going on here?" Angrily, waggling his eyebrows, he shouted and barely on the threshold of the room, "Jenna." The window was open, smoking inside. "Everybody out of here now. And don't let your spirit be here again. Go to your quarters and go home. Where did you come from?" "I don't care." Jenna said calmly. "Come closer. It's my fault." "Don't swear, please." Immaturity in the girl who always considered quietly and modestly. "And how did you manage to do that?" confessed Emily nonchalantly, blinking innocently. "I was cleaning the window on the inside yesterday, of course," she added quickly. "It was very dirty. It was disgusting with the sun shining through. And yet she couldn't help it. On the other hand, I also lost a little foot, even though it's cold." Brr. The girl was defiant and apparently didn't end up buying the clothes trail. "See, they are wrong to enter the hole. How many times painted?" But today the wind picked up the window and opened, and a crow flew into the room. He continued to lie inspiringly. It was huge, so brazen. "But all is we will catch him. But he will not go back inside and rush then in the closet. Then not on the ledge will sit. We hardly catch him. That's why there's such a fuss. Please forgive us." Jenna looked at Emily with her eyes. "Probably from the village." "Yes," nodded the girl. "I can see that." Jenna smiled approvingly. "You have more respect for your elders than these." She nodded to the other students. She bent her knees on the bunk as she did in the kitchen, wearing a shirt. "So this time, I forgive you. But don't give me any more sand squealing." Clearly speaking. "Yes, of course," assured her Stadia. And Jenna, her stomping her staff on the women, retreated to the end of the hallway and thence down the stairs to her post. "Out, crow," laughed Helen, turning to Dan, who had been sitting under the bed all this time. "Otherwise you'd be carrying pies," cawing. A friendly laugh sounded and Dan crawled out, wrinkling his nose defiantly and rubbing his limbs. "What you'll do for a lady." "Stop fooling around." Emily pretended to be angry. "You'd better think about how you'll get out again." "What's there to think about?" The boy shrugged his shoulders. "I'll go out like everybody else down the stairs. Jenna's got you pegged." "And Helen and I will be in trouble," Emily objected. "Well, then I'd better stay here." Dan winked at her with a sly grin. "What?" Emily grimaced at the sight of the place under the bed. "You're free to make yourself comfortable, but you'll have to leave in the morning. The cleaning lady will be here." "No luck," sighed the suitor. "I guess I'll have to go out the way I came in. Out the window. Don't even think about it." Jenna was scared to death. "I'd rather take the stairs. She has keys to the back door." The kids laughed. "Did you really think I'd come in through the window?" "Oh yeah." Emily bristled, feeling insulted to the core. What was the point of this whole show? Did you want to play a joke on the village idiot? Well, did the prank work? Congratulations. She left the room and went back to the kitchen. O caught up with her at the kitchen door. "Wait, go out the back door, without turning around," she said sternly. "Go, that's enough for today, Emily." Suddenly, he slipped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her to him. Always so prickly. After all, it's nothing more than a harmless joke. She wanted to say something cutting, but his sudden closeness took her breath away, and nothing came out. She stood shivering as if she had a fever, and Dan turned her carefully, and their faces were almost close. "You've done well. You didn't give me away, Jenna," he whispered, "although I am not afraid of it. Congratulations." A wiggle. It was Emily, but he was already kissing her. He was kissing her, really kissing her right on the lips, and it was both terrifying and delicious. From that night on, they started dating. She wouldn't let him do anything but kiss her, of course. But the Blue Chulkov's reputation from that moment on was irretrievably undermined. The last bastion fell under the onslaught of the brave knight. Companions jeered, but Emily no longer cared. She fell in love every week. She wrote 2 letters home, one to her mother and grandmother. In the second, she detailed her studies, everything that was going on in high school, and her excursions around Washington. He loved wandering around that ancient and mysterious city, just wandering around, if there was free time, and not necessarily a parade. The downtown streets, the quiet courtyards, and the old, half-abandoned buildings, in some backyard, were no less interesting to him. There was nothing like it in his homeland. And here it was, as if history itself had stepped out of the pages of textbooks and appeared before Emily in all its grandeur. She always took these walks alone. She had no need of noisy, restless societies. In company that fragile charm was lost, old houses and palaces ceased to seem mysterious, and that the shining, even trees of a bygone age fell silent and no longer told their amazing stories. Only the building was different. He himself was like a walking corpus of different stories, and he seemed to know almost everything about Washington. But that's a joke, of course. So I practically grew up with their excursions. My parents came little, then to Portugal, then to Morocco, then to Austria, then to Germany. They've already traveled the world, and the same awaits you and me. Only I won't leave my children to any grandmother, Dan said firmly, questioning Emily a little teasingly. Yes, the boy nodded affirmatively. You and I will have 2 children, a boy and a girl. Wow, you've already thought of that too. What if it's 2 girls? Emily laughed. Well, maybe, Dan agreed. How does it work? Jokes are jokes. But towards the end of the year, he suggested we move in together. No, negative. She shook her head. I can't do it before the wedding. Do you really want a wedding? She looked at the waiting crowd. And a normal delivery won't do. Dumbfounded Emily is like no witnesses even. Yes, she nodded. Witnesses can be the registry office workers themselves. Understand, I don't want you to suffer. I would never suggest you something humiliating. Although, in my opinion, there is nothing humiliating about 2 people who love each other. But I respect your point of view, he quickly added, seeing that Emily was about to get angry. I do, and that's why I propose that we get married. And we can celebrate the wedding when your parents arrive. That will be next year. Well, I will say that Emily was mistaken at home. Don't say anything yet, Dan suggested. When we have a real wedding, then we'll invite you. Until then, we'll live like this, but not for long. I'm going away for an internship in October, Emily said hesitantly. What else did she hug him? What are you afraid of? Dan. She was silent for a moment, not knowing how to broach the delicate subject. What if suddenly we... Understood, Dan. Don't worry. You and I will check in. You'll see a doctor. Will they prescribe any remedies? Progress has come a long way, he smiled. As time goes on with the expansion of the family, I just don't want to leave you. So I'll be there, and you'll be here, and I won't feel comfortable, you know. I understand, Emily replied, smiling, afraid to find someone else without you. I'm scared. He squeezed her against himself for now. I'm so afraid. Maybe we'll leave together. Oh no, I absolutely refuse. Emily, we have 2 years left. We'll get through this somehow. She loved Dan, but still she wasn't going to give up her dream to get a prestigious higher education and see the big world, the real world in all its diversity. Was she now to give in to his pleas? Everything. Sorry, goodbye, education, endless travel, embassy life. It is, of course, interesting and tempting, but there is no telling where she will be sent after the internship, that she will be there to finish her studies, and the children will leave, and that's it. Then the dream is dead. They got married at the beginning of June, and at the end of September she already left for the internship. Emily, I cried a little, not without reason, but I restrained myself in time. There is nothing to schedule. It is necessary to study, and went with his head, as before, to classes, seminars, lectures, coursework, the student newspaper, which they published in foreign languages, of course. There were enough things to do. The only thing that had changed was that he no longer lived in the student dormitory. On the eve of his departure, Dan introduced him to his grandmother, a tall, straight as a board, stern-faced, eagle-eyed old woman. She was the only one who was told of his new status. No one else was aware, neither friends nor parents. Dan's explanation was that he didn't want to upset his mother. Dad hardly cares. He barely notices us, he said with a wry, bitter chuckle. And Mom, she always wanted me to find my true love, a life partner who was right for me. She wanted everything to be perfect. The date, the wedding, lots of guests. You know, I don't need any of that. But I don't want to upset my mother. If we tell her now, she'll worry. She'll worry that everyone will find out, and we won't have a proper wedding. I know it's all weird messianic prejudice, but you understand, right? Yes, Emily nodded. I totally get it. My mother probably wants the same thing. Let's not make them worry. Are you going to finish your degree? I'll be back from my internship and my parents will come home. And then we'll have a real wedding. She won't tell my grandmother. Emily is worried. Grandma is her boyfriend, Dan replied proudly. She's my old lady. What do you need? The closed mouth and the key under the mat. After going to the registry office, they came to the table. The apartment where she lived and where Dan lived impressed Emily. High ceilings, moldings, bronze chandeliers with chandelier, tasseled curtains, some like in a pre-revolutionary era movie. And the furniture was of the kind that only palaces seem to keep. Stealthily, he ran his hand over the flat surface of the huge sideboard. Folded on its carved legs, the warm wooden surface seemed alive. Good evening, Tataki. Her grandmother Dan was sitting in a high armchair and smoking a pipe. Emily thought, trying not to be in too much of a hurry about everything. Well, let me congratulate you, the old lady continued casually. You are now husband and wife, and you are your own masters. I am very glad you are grandchildren. She decided to put me on notice. It may be that before you return, there will be nothing left of me but an urn of ashes. The grandmother began to protest, but the old woman raised her thin, wiry arm, dressed in corpulent black, and continued. In that case, I will trust you, child. What is your name? My dear, I have forgotten something, oh child. Now, Miranda, if it happens that my bruised body leaves Miami, until the rest of the family arrives, will you have to assume the mourning duties as my grandson's wife? Yes, Grandma. Let's get to the happy part, Dan asked. We've already talked about your funeral 1,000 times. Can't we stop now that your funeral is coming up? Then you can do as you please, the old woman said calmly, and let me decide what I do with mine. All right, she softened immediately. Your wife and I will still have time to talk about this fascinating subject. I hope now we can talk about more practical and fun things. He took from the table where she sat a brass bell on a high leg and rang it from somewhere in the distance. At the other end of the large floor, there was a sound of footsteps, of doors, and in a few minutes it seemed to him Yusenko, not too young girl, dressed in a simple blue and white dress in front. And again it seemed that she was somewhere in the XIX century. Now they went out to the entrance, and instead of a car, there were 2 bookshelves waiting for them. And people were walking around dressed in old-fashioned clothes. At least in the atmosphere of this floor it seemed so. Nosenko repeated to the old woman, "Give us some tea, my dear." The servants did not keep them waiting long, and exactly 5 minutes later on the table appeared a tray with delicious, just some old sword lugs, saucers, saucer, spoon, sugar and bent the legs, trigger sugar, as well as all sorts of cookies and small sandwiches. Emily was afraid to even touch this beauty, but she still had to drink tea and smile at this stern old lady. Tell me, baby, you are so Dan. Where are you going to live with your lovely wife? I hope, Babel, you'll let us stay in my father's apartment, the boy said. It's a bit of a mess, of course, but we're not going to extend it yet. He smiled. Of course, agreed the old woman, graciously raising her teacup with 2 fingers. It's too early to expand. I guess, honey, that's who. You've still got a couple of years to graduate. Yes, I've been nodding for 2 years, but I absolutely do not intend to live in your apartment. He was ashamed of his own words and lowered his head. Yes, I don't. What am I going to do there? I'd rather be alone in a dormitory, like before. Do you think that because you're part of our family, you won't have responsibilities?" The old woman asked sharply, and Emily turned pale, realizing she had said the wrong thing. Grandma couldn't take it anymore. She pleaded half-jokingly, "Dan, but you don't frighten her at all. Don't be scared. She's only joking." He patted his young wife on the shoulder who doesn't want to be left alone. "Who would do that at my age?" Grandma raised an eyebrow haughtily. "So, honey, you'll live in the same house, but not with me. Don't worry. We have a small apartment next door, where my son used to live. We keep it tidy, but no one has lived there for years. It's only for occasional guests. You're part of the family now. That's a fact. You must live in the right conditions. We'll entertain ourselves when Dan leaves. Can you play solitaire?" "Baby." "No." Emily shook her head. "Charming." For some reason, the old lady was pleased. "Then I'll teach you." Now she rose heavily from the chair, twisted her shoulder, and with unexpectedly firm step walked toward the surgeon standing at the opposite end of the room. He opened the drawer of the lower drawers and took out a small velvet box. Just as quickly he returned, sat down again and held it out to her solemnly. "Take it, my dear. It's yours now." Carefully he pressed the lever and the lid opened with ease. Inside glittered and glowed a beauty that, upon seeing it, took my breath away. Evidently, it was an ancient, dilapidated frame of a huge ring. Baffled by the crystalline stone and its limited surface, it quivered and evolved in the light of the lampshade over the table at 1,000 small rainbows. Admiring exhaled Emily, cautiously peering into the stone. "Is a diamond." And he looked up when he realized. "Thank you." The older woman smiled at the corner of her lips. "Of course it's a diamond." That's what she said. A diamond. Even emphasizing that unfamiliar pronunciation. "One of our family's 2 stones. You will wear it until your eldest grandson marries. Remember, then you will pass it on to your wife. What if we don't have a grandson, only a granddaughter? Or won't I live to see it?" asked V, waiting for Emily. "So will it pass to the son's wife or go back into the family safe?" Grandma replied. She sighed, "But we'll discuss the details later. Now for an example." Emily carefully put the ring on her ring finger, and it was not enough for her, but on the middle one it suited her. "Perfect. That's it. Put it on for now," said the old lady. After the changeover time, they sat for half an hour, said goodbye to Grandma, took the keys, and went to see the apartment, where they were going to live now. Wait. Dan stopped Emily as she was about to enter. "That's not the way to do it." He picked her up easily and lifted her in his arms, crossed the threshold, gently lowered her into the hallway and kissed her. "And so, yes, Aneshka." She stroked his cheek. "How lucky am I to have you?" "I am the lucky one." He answered her affectionately and helped her take off her coat. "But let's get settled. Tonight we're going to sleep here." Emily was embarrassed when she realized what she was going to have to do tonight. "I don't have anything on me. I'll get started." "I hadn't thought of anything," Dan replied solemnly as he led her to the bedroom door. "Well, take a look." Emily looked in and gasped with pleasure. The large iron-headed bed was strewn with white rose petals, and in vases and roses everywhere. And among the beautiful candles that wrapped the nightstands on the right side was a cardboard box with bandages and gold ribbons. Opening it, Dan smiled. In the box was a set of the most exquisite house linen ever seen, Emily's, in soft cream, a nightgown with some thin pants, a top and shorts in the same color fabric, but with different piping, and a matchless, velvet-like robe. "What a beauty!" She caressed the delicate fabric. "Thank you. You'll find everything you need in the bathroom," her husband told her and lay down on the bed. "I'm waiting." They only managed to sleep that night in the morning and the next day. For the first time in my life, I was late for class, but I didn't regret it at all. There was only one more thing to do, to inform the education department of the change of my last name. "Please don't tell anyone at the school yet," I asked that classmate, with whom I was now very familiar. I knew what to expect from whom. The girls were nice, not vindictive. And what will happen to us for this? The girls made masks. Nothing will happen if you keep quiet, joked Dan, who came with you, anticipating such a turn. And to make the silence more bearable, he handed one of them a rather large box. Out of it came Emily and Dan, followed by enthusiastic cheers. The girls had sewn the box, and apparently, the contents were to their liking. How did he calculate everything beforehand? My husband, who is very thoughtful, prepared it. Emily pressed affectionately against his shoulder and got used to it. He looked around and kissed her quickly. "I'll see you tonight." She smiled, and she stood outside his classroom for half a minute longer, watching him walk away down the hallway with a heavy step. And now the new school year was starting. Dan had left and Emily had been left alone in that beautiful and still somewhat strange apartment, too spacious for her. So from now on her days were like this. She would get up early in the morning, 2 hours before school started, bake homemade scones and cakes, different things, and take them to her grandmother Sandra. That was Sandra's name. "Good morning," said Emily cheerfully, entering the large dark apartment. The old woman couldn't stand the bright light. Her eyes were squinting and the curtains were mostly closed. "I've brought you some scones." "Emily, my dear," replied Grandma, "but I've told you many times not to bother. It's good. It feeds me. I don't know anything." Emily laughed now. "I'm 1 for 2, so you'll eat my buns, and that's it." The old lady smiled happily too, and it was obvious that such attention from a newfound relative. She was very happy. We talked about all sorts of little things, about plans for the next day. Sometimes Sandra would tell her something interesting about Washington, though more often it was over dinner. They had dinner together, Emily. It was very sad to be alone in the evenings. Soon she and her grandmother became friends and very close friends. "You are a good and pure soul, little one," Grandma told her many times. "Stay that way until the end of your days, but only on the inside. And on the outside, you have to grow your own hippopotamus skin. You see, so that the black evil of others won't touch you. Hey, little girl, there are so many bad traits and stupid people in the world." Emily nodded and agreed. And then she told him in turn of her childhood in the village, of her own grandmother, of her mother, of her favorite teacher who showed her the way of life, to whom, as before, she continued to write faithfully every week. "I want so much to tell her everything," complains Emily, Sandra's grandmother. "But I realize it's too soon. Otherwise, there will be no surprise and no celebration." "Yes, you're on time with the news so far," agreed the old lady, and smoked her invariable pipe. Or perhaps she was expressively ogling that autumnal belly, as if she didn't have to warn you first. "No," blushed Emily, "it was nothing like that." She was still at the gynecologist before the birth. She wrinkled her nose at this memory. "We agreed to wait until I finished my studies. Then I would teach languages at the embassy schools. Otherwise, who would hire me? No one." "That's perfectly reasonable." Grandma nodded. "Come on, honey, you have to get up early tomorrow. I'll stay up for a while." That's how they lived. Emily also wrote long, long letters to her husband about everything that happened day to day without him. He answered too, but less often, and much less often. There was no telephone in the apartment where they had settled. Sandra had one, of course. Sometimes they talked to Dan briefly and about almost nothing. But in the end, he would always tell her how much he loved her and how much he missed her. And those evenings were filled with the greatest happiness for the little girl. But one Saturday afternoon, the thing was that Emily had just started cleaning the apartment. It all came crashing down overnight. The doorbell rang, then another and another. The insistent ringing caused Emily to finally take off her thick rubber gloves, set the rag aside and run out of the bathroom, where she was diligently scrubbing the tiles, to the front door. As soon as she opened it, the door burst open with a cannon-like crack. Stunned, she took a step back, and a plethoric woman stepped across the threshold. A brightly painted woman with a face of disgust and squeamishness. That's where you live, she said in a loud, shrill voice, and kicked the door shut. Who are you? Emily was confused. You, my dear, you the lady, paying no attention to Emily, as if she were a soulless fixture of this apartment. She walked into the large living room, then into the kitchen, looked at everything, and was already on her way to the bedroom. But then the girl came out of her stupor and asked sharply, stranger, let me ask who you are and what right you have to come to my apartment. Ah, now we are talking about rights, smiled the lady, pausing. But as you know, I am the mother of your so-called husband's mistress. She said the word ironically all at once and looked me straight in the eye. What I didn't expect. I was completely confused. Everything jumbled together in her head, and an old, not yet colored photo from the family album came to the fore, with her parents standing at their own wedding with a big bouquet, and another of her very young and smiling mother holding a 3-month-old small yes. This aunt was nothing like that sweet young girl, but people change with time. Have you arrived yet? Emily could only blurt out. The lady had already announced herself and was on her arm right in front of her. I'll tell you what, my dear. In her mouth it sounded like a phrase of my homage. Not to you, redneck. You're not your own kind. She's had plenty of your kind. I don't know what you did to seduce him. You must be good at spreading your legs. At these words all the blood rushed to her head, and she dared not object, staggered and clung to the door. And the lady went on without paying the slightest attention to this fact. Now, I can't imagine what she has been saying to him. Men can be very persistent if they need to be. As a woman, you must understand that. She smiled again at the enemy. But you are the one who thinks the worst of yourself. No villager, you hear, will ever enter our family like my daughter-in-law. My father and I already have a suitable match for Dan. They were in the same grade. A nice, decent girl from a very decent family. Besides, she walked into the room like she was at home and sat down on the couch, pulled a handkerchief out of her purse, and waved it, blushing. Besides, we don't want second-rate grandchildren of plebeian blood like yours. Are you incapable of giving birth to a normal child? You hick. You all have underdeveloped brains. He went on and on with horrible insults. He kept saying something else. And finally, Emily couldn't take it anymore. Please go away. She put her hands to her head. What? What did you say? You outraged my mother-in-law into leaving. No, you have to get out of our lives. And I want you out of our lives immediately. Do you hear me? When the nurse comes back, she will have noticed. Go away. Get out of the way, shouted Emily, who had never felt so insulted. Bitter tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't notice. Her temples were throbbing frantically, and she was short of breath. She wanted to break something, preferably against the head of that horrible woman. But Emily overcame this terrible impulse. She ran to the front door, threw it open, and screamed at the top of her lungs. Go away. If you don't, I won't be responsible for myself. The woman blanched. She rose cautiously from the sofa. Looking over, she headed for the exit sideways. Cautiously, she paced the floor, as if every second she expected an attack. And finally, after jumping over the threshold, he shouted for the last time. A redneck doesn't even know how to behave decently. And she ran downstairs. Emily closed the door behind her and slid helplessly on cotton legs to the floor. In Baku, she had an unbearable pang in her throat, in her nose, her eyes swollen with tears, and she wanted terribly to close her eyes and go to sleep. To sleep, not to know, and not to remember all this nightmare, which so suddenly burst into her beautiful, almost fairy tale life. Emily was proud by nature, not by breeding in the first place. This visit offended her terribly. How could she talk like that? From time to time, the terrible phrases and accusations with which Dan, her mother, had riddled her ran through my mind. Lying sleepless in the darkness of the big, loveless orphan bed, Emily wept and wept without being able to stop. She was suffering the most embarrassing of hysterics, a nervous breakdown, but she was inexperienced. There was nothing she could do to help herself in such things. He should have taken some, or at least some chamomile tea, and drunk it, gone, and complained to Sandra's grandmother, told her all about it. Then a terrible and monstrous mistake would have been revealed. But all that, as we have already said, was superb and went nowhere. She did not inquire into the relationship, nor did she call her husband. God save her from such a misfortune. What could I say to him now? It was obvious why she insisted on a secret marriage. It was obvious that her family would never accept her. Great-grandmother Sandra also, of course, agreed, but she decided to herself that the old woman is not the main authority in the family. What could she take away from him? And at the thought of what would happen if she came face to face with her father, she broke out in cold sweats and tremors. If his mother behaved like that, what could he expect from his father? All the more so since her own experience with her father only suggested worst-case scenarios. In the morning, Emily, pale, hesitant, with blue circles under her eyes and utterly desolate, took the family ring off her middle finger, put it on the table, took her things, only those she had before she was married, and left with her suitcase. She left the house for station. He carefully hung the keys to the apartment on the doorknob of the door to Sandra's apartment. He rang the doorbell twice, waited to hear hurried footsteps, and ran out, with a broken head. On the way to the station, he stopped at the post office and bought an envelope with a stamp. He wrote a request for leave of absence for family reasons and mailed the letter to the address indicated. By lunchtime, he was already riding in the Washington Barnall train car, not having the slightest idea what he would do next. But now, it was impossible for her to stay in this city, where she had been treated so unfairly. Sandra, the distraught nanny, brought the key Emily had left on the doorknob to the lady. I went out, and it was lying around. Where to put it? And Emily's not coming today. Doesn't her foot hurt? Give it to me. The old woman frowned, but said nothing aloud to herself. She ate her breakfast and smoked her morning pipe as usual, and told me to give her her coat. Where are you going? Excited. Do you usually read at this hour? I'm not far away. The old woman responded absent-mindedly, placing an old-fashioned hat on her head with the brim exposed. With the brim down, she wanted to get some air. It took Sandra 20 minutes to get out of her own driveway and up to the neighbor's 4th floor. Of course, there was no elevator in her old wide-fronted house. Entering her grandson's apartment, she took a quick look around, noting the complete tidiness, the lack of precise outerwear. And entering the room, she found the ring on the table. There was no note nearby. At Sandra's frown, he took the ring, locked the apartment, and returned to his apartment in the same manner. When she arrived, she sat in her high chair, closed her eyes, and told the men not to disturb each other under any pretext for the next hour and a half. The nanny, taking advantage of this window, took her coat and beckoned her out of the apartment and to the nearest confectionery for a cup of coffee with the other housekeepers, of whom there were many in this rich house. Sitting at a little table by the window, Nanny took out some cheap shimmer powder and checked that her eye makeup was in order. Then May, her girlfriend and neighbor, and other acquaintances came in, who used to rest at that hour. The most convenient time, then the hosts or scattered after breakfast, who went where and would come. Now it's time to eat. There is half an hour free. 5 minutes later, I am there with Buckwheat. Next to her is a pretty girl, Evelyn, from the 19th floor of the first entrance. "Oh, girls, we had such a thing yesterday," she informed her friends in an excited tone. "My Nana came back last night and started going off on everyone. Honestly, Peter and I didn't know where to hide. Then her husband came back, our landlord. She has a problem with him too. It's not like that. And we can hear everything. He put up with it, but he pounded his fist on the table and shook the glass in the cupboard. And she says she's not a woman, or he says, 'I just hate you.' And she sobs and answers him, 'So and so. I've just been next door, where our son has rented an apartment for his yokel, whom he calls his wife in public. Have you heard about this case?' And I told him everything I thought about her. I told her who she was and who we were and what to expect, and she sobbed like a white whale. Well, her husband asked her how you knew where Dan are with his placed. How did you know? My mistress replies, I overheard the girls at the corner bakery chattering that Dan and his young wife had moved into a dark walnut door apartment on the 4th floor next door. He's a bastard. He didn't say a word to us, but he rented the apartment himself. Here to run his bitch. It wasn't far away, so to speak. What makes you think that? Darling? Her husband calmly tells her, what's this about our Danila? The servants were talking. As my mistress says, my eyes are moving. Yes, so she gets up from the table and calls me. Can you imagine, girls? Well, I go out into the hallway. I'm neither dead nor alive. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm going to lose my hotspot, that's for sure. And the owner calmly asks me, Evelyn, honey, tell us, weren't you telling the neighbors about our Dan at the bakery? And I told him the truth. I swear, Nick. It's true, I did. You didn't say it about our Danila. You said it about the guy next door. I think they call him Danila too. I found out personally from his wrinkle that a couple of months ago he got legally married and now lives in his wife's soup in the middle parade room on the 4th floor. And his wife is nice, very affectionate. You heard that. Our master turns on his wife. Go to the people, Dan Dahl, and apologize immediately. He made a scene. I walked into someone else's apartment. Bug, how am I supposed to look you in the eye now? And I ask you, why is she rolling her eyes? She made a fool of me and herself, and our Dan, and you are renting a real apartment. I gave her money personally. Listen, not in this house, God forbid. Jesus, but it's better than going to an underground brothel. I was telling him something else, but I couldn't hear him. The girls ran off on shiny heels, out of danger. Look at her, wild-eyed. Nemo isai, ain keu. So, your mistress has gone to our wall, but it's business, and I wondered why the key on the doorknob was dangling. What key? Friends were interested and squinted curiously, but I had enough brains not to explain anything to them now. It was about time I figured it out. She'll run away. I'm a girl. Sandra is going to give me a hard time. We'll talk some other time. Back at home, went straight to Sandra, carefully scratching under the door and hearing that it was possible to get in through a whirlwind. He burst into the landlady's room and told her what he had heard Evelyn say. You've done well, Nanny said thoughtfully to Sandra. I'm not going to hold you for anything if they come. Well, here are those same parents, Dan, who Evelyn you're serving. They say I'm not at home. Understood. Whenever they come, I'm not there. And that's all. Understood. Understood. How not to understand shook his head. Just Sandra. And what about our daughter? Nanny looked pitifully, and her eyes watered. The old woman said with conviction, but enough is enough. Let's go to Martin's friend's house. When Sandra was left alone, she leaned back on her soft throne and closed her tired eyes. She sat like that for about 15 minutes, got up again, went to the phone, picked up the receiver, dialed a number, said, "Give me the embassy, please." "Yes, of course I'll wait." Eyes red-rimmed and dry, Emily looked out the endless expanse outside the carriage window. Her tears were now beyond measure, and she had run out of tears for this part of her life. It was even worse without them. The swollen eyelids stung like fire from the inside out. After thinking for a while, he got up and went to the conductor's compartment. "Good evening. Do you have any eye cream?" "I have something in my eye, and it itches like hell." "We don't have any creams," said the conductor indifferently. "Would you like some tea with lemon?" "Let's have some," said Emily languidly, and was about to turn and walk away. But then the conductor looked at her and apparently regretted it. "Seeing the state of your eyes, I can give you some Vaseline. I have one printed for me. 50 rupees will do." "It will do," Emily shrugged. "Thank you." The Vaseline made her poor eyes feel better, and she even enjoyed a hot tea with lemon to cheer her up a bit. Her head was no longer buzzing, and the girl lay down on her top shelf to try to take a little nap. She had a long journey ahead of her, though it was unlikely she would be able to sleep now. Her thoughts took her far back in time. Here she was traveling on the same train, but in the opposite direction, to distant, unknown Washington, full of hope. Here the confusion of the first class, the unexpected help from the rector, the dormitory, the knowledge of the film as a student. Dan, how handsome, smart, intelligent he is. How does she love him? Maybe he's not involved after all, and his mother won't be able to stop them. But how could he run away? They've split their lips. You're a filthy hick. That's what they called you. You'll know better than to stick your pig snout in another day. Of course you're no match for him. His mother is absolutely right. You don't even know how to use the wise men's cutlery. What kind of a wife would you be to disgrace yourself and disgrace him? Now stay in your village. These unhappy thoughts and the peaceful rattle of the wheels unloaded Emily, and she herself did not notice how her tired eyes closed and sleep covered the exhausted mind with its dense, soft covering. The gloomy morning had already turned the hall into a long, dull gray day when Emily finally awoke. It took her a long time to realize where she was and to be able to remember how she had come to find herself in the middle of a school term in a train carriage. And as she remembered how things were now, she smiled bitterly as she saw her reflection in the glass. But what, having now played the role of a diplomat's wife, is good? Tell yours. Tell them some nonsense about life in the capital and why you have come in the middle of the school year in your homeland and back to study. It's true that now you will hardly get a place in a dorm, but that's okay. You'll rent it. You'll find a place. Too many people live like this. You'll work part-time as a tutor. Somehow you'll make it through the 2 years you have left. You can't throw it all away because of a failed love. What kind of stupidity is that? Emily said to herself, and finally calmed down. She felt sorry for Sandra, but now she was alone. But what could she do? Fairy tales brought to real life rarely end with a happy ending. After coming to such a disappointing but practical conclusion, she felt hungry. Since he had no research materials with him, he entered the wagon. He sat for a long time studying the menu and ordered the cheapest thing available. Glazed scrambled eggs with 2 eggs and tea. I waited for the order to arrive and ate with gusto. I felt alive again. She went back to her compartment and looked out the window again. Then he got bored. So he pulled a textbook out of his suitcase to waste time. She had already missed a couple of classes. She had been engrossed in her homework all day. And suddenly she realized that she hadn't come up with a believable story. I guess so. Slightly surprised David. Are you visiting someone here? Not exactly. The guy laughed and suddenly slapped his forehead. Come on, I haven't even introduced myself. I'm sorry, for God's sake. Second day on the road. Dan. He bowed his head politely. And you're David, of course. That's right, smiled the man. Please, sit down. He pointed to a chair. Tell me what brings you here. My wife Miranda studied with you a few years ago. She has a different last name now. The guy said, we had an unfortunate misunderstanding, and according to my information, she was supposed to come home here today. David marveled. Emily got married. Yes, smiled Dan. I know she hasn't written to you or told her relatives, but we'll arrange it today, he promised. But lo and behold, David rubbed his temple thoughtfully and thought, is it worth informing this man that Autumn has just been with me? But immediately, honest man that he was, he pushed this low thought away and decided that he would certainly do all he could to see that his unabandoned guest did not offend the girl dear to his master and his heart. Have you seen her by any chance? Has she come to see you? With apparent hope, asked Dan. I was late for the train. I wanted to meet her on the platform. I flew to Barnaul myself, and from there I took a cab directly here. She didn't mention that before that flight I had taken a flight from Prague to Washington, and I had been at home for an hour. Sighing, David said. And he is currently, I believe, at my house. Really? Dan was pleased. "Please show me the way." "Of course," nodded David, "but you'll have to wait a bit while I finish up some business here." "Of course," Dan hastened to say. "I'll go for a walk." "Please, Dan." I stopped him. "Don't try to find your way without me. Any local will tell you where the professor's house is, but you don't have to." David responded to Dan with dignity. "I'm not the most virtuous man in the world, but I'm not a scoundrel either. I realize you don't know me at all and want to protect you. I assure you I greatly appreciate that, as well as your undoubted decency, and I will never try to sneak into your house." He bowed his head as a sign that he had finished speaking and dared not interfere further. And he left the study. David smiled at his own thoughts, nodded approvingly, and went back to checking. He had long since developed that quality in himself, and he was not to interfere with anything, whatever happened there, before he finished his work. An hour later, he and Dan were walking the same path as Emily. Shortly before them, talking down the road about everything in the world, David had become more and more convinced that her husband was a good man and was glad that he had not yet lost his ability to judge people. Visitors were so rare in town that there was no one to use and improve his social skills. "Please, Dan," said David. When they arrived at the house, I waited a few minutes in the yard. While I announced their arrival, it would be unfair to shock her like this. Can you imagine how she would feel if she suddenly saw me in your company? "Yes," Dan agreed. "I wanted to do it too, but I didn't have time to tell them. You warned me. And of course, if she doesn't want to see you, I'm not going to persuade her. But of course, I don't have to explain it to you," said David politely. "No need," Dan agreed. "But please tell her that what happened was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Nothing more. And that if he doesn't want to see me, I'll sit here in front of your house until he comes out." Why go home in early October? It was not yet time for the session. The winter vacations were far away. What was there to say when she got on the train upset? For some reason, it hadn't occurred to her. And now, luckily, I couldn't think of anything. In the end, I decided not to go home. Why should I? I wanted, of course, to see my grandmother's mother and talk to them, ask their advice, especially my dear grandmother, whom I hadn't seen for 4 years now. Curiously, Sandra, despite her primness and aristocracy, sometimes looked very much like her own grandmother. Perhaps all grandmothers are the same in the world. I didn't know the answer. He would have to see, however miserably, only his beloved teacher. She could tell him all about it, and he wouldn't mourn or cry, wouldn't rub the fresh wound. A couple of days and catch a return ticket. Such a decision made, he finally calmed down and went to bed. The train arrived early, 6¼ hours, and then there was still a bus to catch to the center of the district, and from there a long ride to the end. Living in Washington for 4 years, she was already used to such distances. In the afternoon, she arrived in the town where her home school was located. The familiar outline of the buildings, the school stop, the porch. It was a weekday, so David is in the classroom, as usual, at his teaching post. "All right, children. Today we're going to look at the simplest form of all time in the English language. The present simple. Write it down in your notebooks." Emily peeked cautiously through the open door. There it is. There it is, so familiarly native. Practically a silhouette standing by the blackboard, writing something in chalk. She won't distract you during the lesson. A serious audience of 7 has to listen to a lesson by the book, and to think there are only 7 of them. What is going on? Soon, there will be no one left in the village. In the company of such unfunny thoughts, Emily sat in a chair in the hallway and waited for the school bell to ring. Knock, knock. She peered into the study. When once the student cheerful flock jumped awake hen, Emily did not say, but wondered David. "Why are you here? You're not welcome." With a mocking defiance replied Emily, and immediately went over to hug the teacher. "That's the way it is. Everything's fine at school. Don't worry. Has something happened at home?" The teacher was worried. "No, as far as I know." Emily pulled away. She looked into his eyes. "I'll tell you later." "Okay, I won't be long. Can I sleep over tonight?" Of course, David was both happy and discouraged. Of course he was. "Here's your key. Don't forget where I'm flying," he joked. "I still have classes until 2. See you later." "Okay, I haven't forgotten," she assured him. Emily took the key, thanked him, and left the school. Reluctantly, she wandered around town, looking at what new things had appeared while she was gone. He didn't really see any special changes. There was a new roof on one of the houses, and here was a tree taller than a telegraph pole, which was quite small when she was gone. So she walked to David's house. She opened the latch of the gate and, passing through the old neglected garden, opened the door of the house. Nothing had changed at all, and it was as if I were back in my school days. David, meanwhile, had finished his last lesson and was sitting at his desk, going through his meager notebooks. "Excuse me, please, can an unknown, good-looking guy come into your office? Please come in." I stood before the unknown David and thought to myself, what kind of day is it today? I've had a lot of surprises. "I'm sorry, but I don't remember us meeting," he said to the young man, shaking his hand in greeting. "You're right, we don't know each other," the visitor replied. "Or rather, I know you from my wife's stories, and you don't know me, as far as I understand, even in absentia." "I'll tell you about it," David promised, and gave an involuntary smile as he imagined such a picture. Yes, the whole town would flee. Nothing happens here for years. And this will be news. So the news will spread throughout the neighborhood. So everyone who met him had already had a good look at the stranger. And now almost every house is talking about who he is and why he has come to their God-forsaken land. David knocked at his own door and entered. He took off his boots and left them in the hay. He knocked on the front door again and opened it. Emily was sitting on the couch with her legs tucked in and reading something. When she saw the professor, she perked up and jumped up to meet him. "How nice of you to come in already. I wanted to fix something to eat, but I was too embarrassed to rummage through the cupboard. Say, if you need me, can I run to the store now?" "Wait, Emily." She stopped her boiling enthusiasm. "Sit down." Emily, smiling, sat back down at the table, and the teacher sank down beside her, looked at her, stroked her cheek gently, as in childhood. "How are you, honey?" she asked affectionately. "I'm fine, David. I'm just going through a phase right now," she sighed, not knowing how to begin. Then suddenly, she made up her mind. "I suddenly decided to come. I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't write. Forgive me, it's just that I got married, David," he said, looking away. She was ashamed to admit that she had not told him about such an important event in her life. "My husband, he is a very good man, but I realize that we are not a couple, that I never reached his level, the demands of his family, of his environment." Her eyes filled with tears. "Emily." He stroked her arm. "Darling, listen to me. Please don't cry. Don't cry and don't worry. I'm sure your husband doesn't think so." "How could he know?" "Bitter?" asked Emily. "He told me so himself," she answered calmly. Master, what did not understand the girl, as who said. Her husband Dan smiled. A little sly master. Now he is languishing waiting outside that door. David nodded slightly in the direction of the front door and told me that if you do not want to see him, he will sit outside my house for as long as necessary. No, that's impossible." She shook her head, stupefied. Emily. She shook the information that didn't fit reality. "Are you confused about something, David?" "Yes, they're in the Czech Republic now. He's on an internship there. But then go and see for yourself," the professor suggested and shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps confused, Emily jumped up and ran around the house, not knowing what she should do. She looked at the windows, but they faced the other way. The neglected orchard was badly mangled, the bare branches of the cherry trees intertwined, stretching their icy, round fingers to the very glass, and it all felt wrong in her chest, exhausted by the sickness of her heart. Desperate with longing and hope, she looked up at her master. He answered her with a calm, knowing look, and for a second she covered her eyes, which meant, no doubt, yes, of course. Go to your wife. She is waiting for you. She has come 1,000 miles to see you, only you. He moved his head slightly toward Emily's exit, shrieked like a sweaty, shot bird. And as I was shoeless in just socks I didn't dress. He jumped all from there to the street on the frozen autumn garden. Emily, yes, did not see her and rushed to her. And she rushed to him with all his strength, not feeling the cold, not thinking about the fact that Emily is not even dressed. He wrapped his arms around her, pulled her to himself, and filled her face with burning kisses. My favorite silly girl, why did you run away? My God, you're barefoot. He reached for her, picked her up in his arms, and carried her into the house. David sat at the table with his chin under his hand and looked out the dusty window at the overgrown garden, the cherry branches, and the patch of sky between them. And their eyes were filled to overflowing with her tears of joy well into the night. These three newlyweds, who had been reunited, and a lonely old village schoolmaster, were talking and drinking hot, strong tea with brandy, which David solemnly drew from his meager strategic reserves, saying that such a meeting should be celebrated. As you understand, Dan, I don't drink at all, but I understand very well today, smiled Dan. I'm like a squeezed lemon myself, Emily. You could use some too. You've suffered the most. My poor girl. Interrupting each other, they told David everything that had happened in the last year, and especially in the last few days. The events that had taken place during the 2 days that Emily, dead with shame and pain, had traveled on the train, were unknown to him. Therefore, Dan told her in more detail. Imagine, I'm in Prague, quietly working at the embassy. I miss my young wife, of course. He smiled and put his arm around Emily's shoulders. And then I get the news that Washington is calling me. I, of course, immediately assume only the worst, and first of all, that my grandmother is in trouble. She is, after all, already 83 years old. I torment myself to the office phone to carry on normal civil conversations. I pick up the phone with a cracked heart, and hearing my grandmother's voice in the first few seconds makes me feel better. But then she told me that I had fallen where I was standing. But the chair was very comfortable. Anyway, she tells me in her usual tone, "But you know that, kiddo." He winked at Emily. And parodying Grandma's manners, he said, "Baby, you don't worry, but you have to fly to Barnaul now." Of course, I was shocked to the extreme and asked why. What had happened? Nothing yet. It's nothing. I want to tell you. She answers me. Everyone is alive and well. But if you don't go now, the worst will happen. Jesus, Emily, can you explain it properly? I got very angry and shouted into the phone. The staff passing by were already looking at me uncomfortably. Listen carefully, grandson, I'm not going to repeat myself, said the grandmother and reported as briefly as she could. Who broke into the apartment? Our flatmate, Nina, your partner's mother, told her rudely that she was a country bumpkin and unworthy of being part of such an intelligent family. She is a mother. I was shocked. She's a complete idiot. Surely that's a quality totally inherent in her tiny brain. My grandmother agreed with me nonchalantly. But in this case, she only made one mistake, you know. She overheard the girls in the bakery talking about Dan, and she thought it was him. Her son has moved to the entrance of the center, rented an apartment, and put his mistress there, whom, according to rumors, he is going to marry soon, and in the meantime he introduces her to everyone known and unknown as his wife. And it is really true. Dan, naturally, rents an apartment for this purpose. But not in our house, but in a neighboring street. But the maids also made a mistake and misunderstood him. So it turned out to be a spoiled telephone game. Only the evil game is cruel. Grandma sighed heavily. And our Emily, you know, honey, I've grown very fond of her. During your absence, she is a beautiful, sincere, pure, loving girl. Our thought it was really your mother who had come and said all those nasty things to her. She left without saying a word to me and left the keys and the ring behind. I made the connection and found out that the same day she took out train tickets for Barnell. He is clearly on his way home now. My God, I've been clutching my head imagining what you, my dear, must have been thinking. Dan looked regretfully at Emily. I'm sorry, honey. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I should have shown you the last pictures of your parents. My grandmother doesn't have any of these. They are practically her old ones from her wedding. No one thought this would happen. My mother is nothing like that idiot Nina. Trust me, her antics have had the whole house groaning for years. Look, here are my parents and Dan in hand, and David a very good quality color one. The picture where she was sitting, posing for the photographer with a needle, dressed up, and married couple grown in age, but still wonderful. A handsome man in an immaculate blue shirt with a tie, a little bright brown curls, and the woman is simply beautiful with dark hair pulled back in an elaborate style, and in such a stunning dress. She totally has her mother's eyes, admired Emily, handing the photo to the teacher and smiling. I agree. You really do look a lot like your mother, Dan. So, continued the boy after the presentation of the physical evidence. As soon as I realized how things were, I ran to the boss, wrote a request for urgent leave of absence for family reasons. I had to tell them that my grandmother was dying. Otherwise, I would have taken too long to explain it to them. She told me to do it, by the way. She said she had the right to die unexpectedly. Baby. But it's not written anywhere that I don't have the right to suddenly get better. So I'm going to use my old granny and keep my head down, as they say. Will provide us with the necessary certificate of my hospitalization. I have already made arrangements with him. And the rest you know, smiled Dan David. The train station, that is, the airport, and then another. In Washington, my grandmother was waiting for me, and she took a cab. Nanny accompanied her. She told me to give this to you, honey. She turned to herself, pulled a velvet box out of her pocket, and pulled a lever. Please, in it always, and don't forget that there is no circumstance in the world that you and I couldn't handle well together, and promise to tell me always and everything before you make such momentous decisions, and any serious decisions at all. Dan corrected myself and gently kissed her cheek. She lowered her eyes behind her style, pulled back, and softly said, promise. Great. David diffused the situation. And I have a gift for you, though not a very good one. Please don't judge me harshly. I wasn't prepared for your arrival. He opened the cupboards, took out a package, tied plain. Here you are. Please. I'll save it for when I see you again. What is it? Emily smiled and carefully unwrapped the unexpected surprise. Oh my God, she gasped. Look at this. She handed the open roll to her husband of gray, or rather papers. There lay 2 volumes of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and the posthumous notes of the club, both in English. Both in English. Where did he get them from? Dan marveled. Unfolding the beautifully illustrated volumes, Frank. Some old classmates sent them to me from there, smiled the professor at my request. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Emily, shedding tears of gratitude and joy that all the horror she had been through had been so happily explained, hugged her favorite teacher. Tomorrow we'll go see your parents, Dan said firmly, and we'll invite them to the wedding. Grandma made me take money from her and pay for all the expenses, including buying tickets for your parents. She said that a dying man's last wish had to be carried out. Dan laughed. And that I might not last another 2 years before we could have a real wedding. What about your parents? Could they come? No, I shook my head. They can't. But we can all go. We'll have a wedding at the Austrian embassy. Mom is preparing all the visas. We'll just need copies of your passports. We'll make them tomorrow in Barnell. In 2 months they will come to Washington, and from there we will join them by plane. You are welcome too, David. If it weren't for you, we would never have met since the fall. It's scary to think about. No objection. The boy shook his head, seeing that the professor wanted to object. We can't do it without you, and even Grandma will fly, he said for the last time. Added Dan quietly, and he put on a straight face. Let me keep saying, David asked. And both of them. Both of them and Dan nodded in unison, of course. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I will surely take advantage of it. And to your grandmother, Dan, a wonderful, rare person. Few people in her position would be so devoid of the prejudices possessed by many of us. I would like to toast to her health and yours as well. May all go well in your life, and may you meet more good, honest, decent people along the way. Looking at you, I feel that I have not lived my life in vain. David gets emotional and wipes his eyes with a napkin. Unfortunately, I was not destined to visit Austria. Emily's favorite professor died of a heart attack 2 weeks after they met. Emily, heartbroken, sobbed for 3 days straight, but the wedding went ahead, and everything went as planned, solemnly sumptuous with a grand scope. From a distant Altai village flew to them only the mother. My father could no longer represent the family honor, and my grandmother flatly refused. She said that she was not in those years, my dears, to travel in Austria. But in spite of everything, everyone was happy, and the event went like clockwork. The happy couple named their firstborn David in honor of the man who played a decisive role in their destiny, who once instilled in a shy village girl that everything in this life depends only on ourselves.